These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? Paris isn't simply the capital of France, it is the artistic capital of the world. For centuries, this city has been a kind of buzzing hive of the West's cultural and artistic development, home to thriving communities of go-ahead artists and some of the world's most important artworks. Amidst the hustle of Paris, art is everywhere. Good art, not so good art. But there is one modestly sized gallery hiding something sensational. The Musée de l'Orangerie, built as a hothouse for oranges and lemons, holds one of the most extraordinary works that has ever been made. These rooms are the Sistine Chapel of Impressionism, and these are Claude Monet's Waterlilies. I've come here again and again, and I've been moved to tears almost every time. No artist had ever attempted to capture the rippling, heartbreaking evanescence of life like this, and no one has come close ever since. It's a 360-degree immersion into the glittering waterscape of a different and a better world. There are 8 of these huge, curved panels, and standing in this room, you are surrounded by them. It is an almost hallucinatory feeling. You have different moods and colors of the sky, wind scudding across the water, different times of the day. And it's very hard to know how close to stand to these pictures as well, because to really see any of them, you have to go to the far side of the room and look back from a long distance. And yet, to properly understand them, you almost need your nose rubbing up against the canvas so that you can see the blistered, scrumbled, erupting and falling effect of Monet's extraordinary paintwork, the fruit of many, many decades of arduous study. These were the last works Monet produced, working relentlessly for 12 years. With them, he created a vision of life that still speaks clearly over a century after his oil paint first dried. More than 1 million people come into these rooms for that sense of serenity, and they walk out feeling calm and serene and reassured about the world, which is exactly not the story of the origin of the pictures. Behind these giant canvases, there lies a story of personal tragedy, of a brutal war, and a tormented man with a final, insatiable obsession. Claude Monet was born in Paris in 1840. His father wanted him to go into the family grocery business, but it wasn't for Monet.
He spent a lot of time out of doors, which is what fueled his passion for nature. And he was a brilliant caricaturist, and he was always, as a young age, drawing people.
Monet was a rebel right from the start, a man destined to change French painting forever. Using new, industrially made, easy-to-carry paints, he developed a fresh way of painting outside, trying to snatch fast-changing light and colour. Like an athlete against the clock, he worked with a frantic urgency, desperate to catch a moment before it vanished forever.
He would go out to the riverbank, set up and begin capturing very quickly the scene that he saw in front of him, catching the interplay between light and shadow, capturing how the light changed and getting this very immediate image.
He was concerned with visual sensation, something that is almost an emotional response to a scene.
But this style of painting ran counter to the art establishment around him.
You see the type of painting that was in fashion, very grand, serious, that today we dismiss as bordering on the sentimental.
Painters were still doing mythological scenes or doing scenes from the Bible or from French national history, Joan of Arc, for example. And there was an appeal for painters to paint modern life. Monet really was the one who maybe took it to the next level.
In 1874, Monet and a like-minded group of hairy young radicals had their first exhibition to showcase this new artistic movement.
Monet's contribution was a beautiful painting entitled Impression: Sunrise.
It was a dawn scene of fishing boats in the harbor, and he did it very quickly, probably painted it in the course of a morning or even less than that.
It does just give a suggestion of what's happening. The shadow of the boats on the water, so different from everything that had gone before.
But unfortunately for Monet, who was struggling to provide for his young family, the reviews of the exhibition were utterly damning.
Most people thought they were sketches made in preparation for something that was going to come after.
There is shock, surprise, hostility.
The critics said, do not go and see this work. It's the work of madmen. It's bad for your health. There was a health warning.
One also said they are impressionists in that they do not reproduce a landscape, but convey the impression it makes.
That is what gives birth to the name Impressionism. It wasn't a name that they chose themselves. It was a name that a critic gave them.
And yet in these early works, with their immediacy, their freshness, you can see the stirrings of what was to come. His art might hover over the calm tranquility of nature, an art of gardens, rivers and meadows, but as Monet fought to make it, he was an increasingly tormented figure.
He would physically attack his canvas. He would take a penknife and slash it. He would stamp up and down on his canvases. He would put his foot through it. And he would also set fire to them. People would arrive and witness a kind of bonfire of the canvases as all of the work that he'd been doing for the past day or two went up in smoke.
To develop, Monet would need to get closer to the source of his inspiration, to look ever deeper, to stare ever harder. Although Monet's career was forged here, in the heart of Paris, his own heart was always somewhere else. And in 1883, in middle age, he decided to make a momentous move, which would change the paintings he made for the rest of his life. And it would mark the beginning of an obsession that would lead him to the creation of his monumental Waterlilies. Claude Monet's grand decorations are a unique masterpiece, a collection of 8 vast panels sweeping across 2 oval rooms. These canvases are the culmination of a nearly 4-decade-long obsession. Waterlilies, which in French are called nymphias or nymphs, have become as associated with Monet as, for instance, sunflowers with Van Gogh. And just as those sunflowers would be inspired by Van Gogh's move to the country, so it would be for Monet and his beloved lilies. In 1883, Monet arrived in the small village of Giverny and fell in love with a pink farmhouse, whose woodwork he painted a bright green. This would become a home for him and his growing family for the rest of his life. Plunging into its large, overgrown garden, he could shape nature to feed his art. At Giverny, it's hard to spot where the gardening ends and oil painting starts.
The only time he found he was happy was when he was surrounded by nature and colour.
He planted everything very consciously and created a kind of canvas, a living canvas that he could paint.
And alongside his studio and his work, this would become a busy family home. Monet lived here with his two children, Michel and Jean, and, after the death of his first wife, his new love, Alice Ochde, and her 6 children. His great-grandson, Philippe Piguet, remembers visiting the house as a young boy.
Nous venions souvent ici, tantôt pour venir chercher des œufs, du poulailler, tantôt pour aller pêcher avec mon frère au bassin. Ou bien alors il y avait un autre jeu qui nous plaisait beaucoup, c'était de jouer dans le grand atelier des nymphéas. On s'amusait comme des fous, on était gamins.
The house and gardens that would become Monet's inspiration, his refuge, have remained today exactly as they were when he lived here.
Nous sommes ici dans la salle à manger de Claude Monet. C'est une salle à manger que je connais bien. Petit, j'ai mangé à cette table. C'est là où se tenaient les repas familiaux, une famille assez nombreuse, puisque Monet s'est installé ici à Giverny avec ses 2 enfants et avec Alice Ochde et ses 6 enfants.
It was the beginning of an extraordinarily productive decade. Monet's obsession with nature led to the creation of some of the most famous Impressionist paintings ever produced. From the coast of Normandy to the boulevards of Paris, from cathedrals to cornfields, Monet chose images which spoke to the French people. His painting broke boundaries all the time and was often revolutionary, but above all, he was intensely patriotic. And the world quite quickly caught up with his vision. The artist who'd once been so readily dismissed began to find himself highly in demand.
After the late 1880s, certainly through the 1890s, for the rest of his life, he was really #1. He was extremely popular with the critics, with the public. He was described as having the greatest eye in the history of art, this marvelous gift of the gods. And so it's not just that his prices are very high. He was the most famous painter in the world.
Monet's career flourished. So did his finances. By the 1890s, he had 8 gardeners, and in 1893, he embarked on the project that would come to define him for the rest of his life. His water lily pond.
He had water siphoned off from the river into his garden pond, and this Japanese bridge over it.
He planted irises and tulips, forget-me-nots, roses and wisteria, but it was the water lilies that would win his heart. Finally, he had the perfect subject for his obsession with light, movement and colour.
Il se lève tôt le matin, très tôt. Il prend un bon petit déjeuner et il est au travail dès 8 heures du matin jusqu'à midi. À midi, c'est le déjeuner. On se retrouve en famille, on prend le café, et puis ensuite, à 14 heures, il retourne à l'atelier travailler. Et il revient vers 18 heures, mais il se couche très tôt. Parce que, comme on le dit, qu'est-ce que vous voulez que je fasse une fois que le soleil est couché?
In a letter, Monet wrote, "All at once I had the revelation how wonderful my pond was, and I reached for my palette, and I've hardly had any other subject since that moment." This was his passion project. Over the next 2 decades, he created around 250 canvases of the same pond, unaware that they'd become the inspiration for his great masterpiece to come. I've always been fascinated by this extraordinary and evolving body of work. Monet painted his water lily pond in every season, every time of the day, every kind of weather. He was obsessed by trying to paint what, strictly speaking, can't be painted. Movement. He was trying to capture the unstoppable shifts of light and colour on the surface of the water, what you might call the flicker of the real. Monet's brushwork changed with almost every piece, ranging from bold dashes and confident flourishes to gentle, fluid strokes. At times, he used a palette knife, building up layers to create the illusion of vegetation. 250 paintings of the same thing. Everyone is completely different. And you know, it's not just the time of day or the weather that makes them different, it's the mood as well. So there are kind of dreamy, languorous moments, saturated in light violets and purples. And then there are other paintings which are almost hallucinogenic, as if he was on some kind of drugs. The colours are so strange and so intense and so bright, you think, what was going on there? Nothing has ever looked like that. And there are others, again, where there's just a joyous, gentle, youthful, kind of exuberant, almost adolescent sense of colour. Bright blues, bright whites and reds, just something that makes you feel happy. For more than 20 years, Monet had lived a quiet but intensely productive life, hidden away from prying eyes, making paintings of his pond, his garden, and his family. But then in 1911, this quiet seclusion was brutally ended.
In 1910, Elise was diagnosed with leukemia, and she died in May of 1911. Monet understandably was devastated. Elise truly was the love of his life. And in his letters to his friends, he would say, "I am annihilated. The painter in me is dead, and all that remains is the inconsolable husband."
Cette photo est une photo qui représente Alice Monet. Elle est datée de 1910, 1 an avant la mort. C'est une photo que ses enfants lui ont donnée pour qu'il ait un souvenir de sa femme.
She'd looked after him, she'd been his housekeeper, she'd been his beloved wife. Real love affair, and he just gave up.
More bad news followed. When he finally turned back to painting, he had to accept he could barely see.
His vision had started to become extremely blurred. This, for an artist, was devastating.
And he really felt that this was now going to mark the end of his career.
Monet had developed a cataract in his right eye. The old painter's misfortunes were piling up, and in 1914 he was dealt the cruelest blow of all. His beloved son, Jean, who was just 46, died.
When his son passed away, he took it very badly. It broke him.
He was completely despondent and despairing, probably at his lowest.
He became so depressed that he stopped painting. He couldn't pick up a paintbrush.
And so at the age of 73, after having bestrode the art world for decades at this point, Monet was downing tools.
To him, paint and colour was life, and he was too depressed to go into the studio and paint. He wanted to stay in the sadness so that he could fully mourn for the family that he'd lost.
For more than 60 years, Monet had made art continuously. But now, as grief overwhelmed him, he found he simply couldn't paint. If this master was ever to work again, let alone begin a masterpiece that would consume the rest of his life, It was going to take the intervention of an unlikely friend and further tragedy on an epic scale. In 1914, the world's most famous artist, Claude Monet, essentially stopped painting. Overcome by grief and failed eyesight, his paintbrushes and studio were left untouched until the intervention of a close friend, the former French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. They'd first met in 1860s Paris when Clemenceau was a young journalist and Monet a struggling artist.
The friendship between Monet and Clemenceau survived and thrived despite the fact, maybe because of the fact, that they were opposites in so many ways. If Clemenceau was the fearsome tiger, Monet was what Clemenceau called the hedgehog. And he always needed someone like Clemenceau or like his wife Elise, someone who could support him.
Clemenceau would come to see Monet and chat to him, to lift him up and try and convince him not to be so depressed and to start painting that would cheer him up. And then between them, they discussed this idea that Monet had already had, but between them, the idea became bigger and more grand.
And that project was to radically expand his obsession with the pond and the water lilies.
This is something that Monet had gone back and forth with throughout his life.
He's been painting the water lily ponds for years and years and years.
And Clemenceau said, these are really rather good. And that was all that Monet seemed to need at that point.
This would be more than a painting, it would be an experience in virtual reality.
Le plus important dans ce projet, c'est le concept d'avoir pensé une œuvre à 360 degrés, donc une œuvre dans laquelle le visiteur est invité à être totalement immergé.
It would evoke the experience of standing on the edge of his pond at Giverny.
This would be on a scale Monet had never attempted before. Each canvas would be 6 by 14 feet, and he planned to paint a whole family of them.
This was huge, this project. First of all, he had to paint the canvases in the garden because he didn't have a studio that was large enough. They were put on wheels so he could move them around and see what they looked like together.
He replaced his old dilapidated studio with a new one specially built to fit his huge canvases. This was the greatest artistic challenge Monet had ever taken on, and time was not on his side. The peace and calm of France was shattered as the Great War now engulfed Europe.
Giverny might seem a small, beautiful place, far removed from the Western Front, but in fact, war came to the village and really stayed there throughout the 4 years that Monet was working on his paintings.
Most of the villagers hurriedly abandoned their homes, not Claude Monet.
And Monet said, if the barbarians want to kill me, they'll have to do so in front of my life's work.
He could hear the fighting, he could hear the bombs and the shooting. Within the first few months, so many young soldiers were killed.
The war was personal to him. Giverny was only 50 kilometers away from the front line, and his stepson and his son were both fighting. He was also growing vegetables in his garden, which he would take to the soldiers in the local hospital to make sure that they had nutrition.
With the war in such close proximity, Monet's methods became dramatic, almost frantic. His grief and encroaching blindness produced a frenzy of creativity comparable to Shakespeare in his prime or the last years of Beethoven.
Painting was such an important part of his life that it was also something that can inspire great rages. As with many artists, with great art comes great temperament, and Monet was definitely no stranger to that.
Never before had this prolific artist painted with such urgency and from such a dark, desperate place.
It was all-consuming. He did not stop. That's what he was doing dawn till dusk.
Monet was literally painting these beautiful works of art as France was experiencing the darkest chapters in its history. It was descending into the abyss. 1 million people were dying in France as he was working. And that obviously was on his mind the entire time he was working on them.
But he still felt the same way about his water lilies as he had when he first planted them. These landscapes of water and reflection have become an obsession for me, he'd written to a friend. It is beyond my strength as an old man, and yet I want to render what I feel.
The colours became wilder, more outrageous. The brush marks became less controlled.
His subject became smaller. It was all the pond. The only areas of sky and horizon are reflections.
Finally, at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, the pounding of the guns ceased. After 4 long years and millions dead, the war was over. And the following day, the 12th, Monet decided that once his grand water lilies were finished, he would donate them to the French people.
If you travel in France, you will find every small village has a monument to the First World War. It was a searing, traumatic national experience. Monet, too, felt this tragedy and wanted to make this gesture to contribute something that would perhaps help avert war again and at the same time commemorate the sacrifice of a whole generation.
To an old political ally, now France's ferocious wartime Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, he wrote, "It's not much, but it's the only way I have of taking part in the victory." When you think about it, these are a very strange proposition for a war memorial. Most countries get great granite columns or stone arches or heroic soldiers done in bronze. And France, what does France get from Monet? France gets some reflections and aquatic plants. But what Monet, in his wisdom, realized was that grief-stricken, harried, anxious people needed a contemplative, even a philosophical experience. These colossal canvases were meant to speak to the spirit of a nation ripped apart by the most brutal conflict the world had yet seen. But rather than hand them over at the moment they might be needed most, Monet couldn't quite let them go.
Monet never felt that he'd finished his paintings, these grandes décorations that he called them. He always felt he needed to do more. He needed to add a bit of paint here, a leaf there, a petal here.
Monet was a perfectionist, and I don't think he was ever happy with any of his paintings. I think he always felt they could be better. One of the wonderful quotes he has is when he wrote to Clemenceau and said, "When I am dead, I shall find their imperfections more bearable." While alive, he could never accept them, and he could never accept that this was everything that he could do.
8 years after the end of the war, on the 5th of December 1926, Monet died, aged 86. For his last moments, Clemenceau, the radical, patriotic politician who'd become his closest friend, was at his side. And on the day he was buried, a mist descended over Giverny.
As one journalist said, Normandy became a Monet painting, almost as if the elements themselves were paying tribute to the artist who had captured them so beautifully for the rest of the world to see.
Shortly afterwards, his vast panels were transported from Giverny to the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris, where they were installed exactly as Monet had prescribed. There was nothing like them anywhere. The shape of the 2 oval rooms meant those who visited would have no sense of where the cycle of canvases began or ended.
He'd very carefully decided which ones he wanted alongside each other, adjacent, juxtaposed and all in the gallery. They are exactly as he would have arranged them.
We get to see, when we go into those two rooms, an art exhibition curated by Monet himself. These were the paintings that he hand-picked.
He wanted people to be surrounded by them, which meant they had to be displayed in a panorama.
What we would describe today as an installation that would be immersive.
What Monet had imagined was a way for the viewer to escape into his world. Monet made these pictures so big for a purpose. They surround you, they envelop you. And because they're so big, you can't simply concentrate on one part of one picture for very long. Your eye is caught endlessly by the next thing. And as you let yourself be surrounded and enveloped by these pictures, you get a sense of timelessness, of endlessness. But as you get lost in the cycle of life, it's almost as if a pattern begins to emerge. After a while, you realize that what's happening as one bit of one picture fades into another bit of another picture, as one color bleeds into another color, every color is changing and morphing and rippling around you, and you realize after a while that these are perhaps the world's only really successful paintings of time moving.
The physical dimensions are really significant. The way in which you walk into an entire architectural space and feel as if you are standing there on the edge of the pond, looking across this surface.
Monet's great installation would finally open to the public in May 1927. But the big question remained, would the world be ready for these paintings? Claude Monet's grand decorations, the culmination of a lifetime's work and his gesture to the French people after the First World War, were finally ready to be unveiled to the world after his death. This was a project that may have taken the artist 12 years, but was the world ready? When Monet's extraordinary waterscapes finally went on display to the public in May 1927, just a few months after the artist's death, they completely tanked.
The reviews were terrible. They said that he had left behind nature, which he had painted so convincingly for much of his career, and begun painting internal impressions instead.
They were really criticised. Oh, scathing criticism. The critics said that he hadn't moved on from Impressionism.
They really saw this as the work of someone who had lost his way artistically and maybe even lost his way emotionally or mentally. Monet's godson wrote that Monet died twice, once in Giverny in 1926 and then a second time with the opening of the Orangerie.
Just as the world hadn't been ready for Monet's first exhibition 50 years earlier, so the same thing happened now. People did not come. Clemenceau was devastated. In June 1928, he observed there wasn't a soul there. As Monet's vast canvases began to gather dust, their tailor-made gallery was taken over for other needs.
The space that was built for them was covered with false walls to show other artworks by other artists and other exhibitions.
There were medieval tapestries shown in front of them. When the ceiling leaked and water dripped on the paintings, nobody really cared.
And they used the room almost like a centre for other activities, dog shows even.
That was humiliating enough. But in August 1944, towards the end of the Second World War, the Orangerie was bombed and Monet's canvases were damaged. It was a catalogue of relentless indignities. With shrapnel from Allied shells buried in the canvases, Monet's grand decorations, the work on which he had driven himself to exhaustion for the last 12 years of his life, were now effectively forgotten. As a final insult to Monet's work, in 1966, the Orangerie acquired a new collection of art. and one of the new gallery spaces was built directly over the room of the Waterlilies, cutting off these paintings so brimming with life from all daylight with a solid concrete ceiling. And that's how they remained for 3 decades. So, how were these extraordinary paintings rediscovered to the point where they became the most famous water lily images in the world?
Just off Fifth Avenue stands the spanking new home of a nationally important institution, the New York Museum of Modern Art.
The next chapter of this story begins in New York, in the then achingly cool Museum of Modern Art. Inside was one of Monet's water lily paintings, a forerunner to his grand decorations.
While the reaction was negative in Europe, over in New York, people were flocking to see that.
And it was becoming a magnet for a new wave of American artists, the abstract expressionists. They painted big, and they wanted to see the vast canvases that the smaller water lily paintings had inspired.
Every young American painter coming to Paris flocked to the Orangerie to pay homage to the great Claude Monet and to see these paintings that they had been hearing about for themselves. And they were astounded by them.
They absolutely loved them, went back to America and started to paint, inspired by them.
Rothko, Jackson Pollock, de Kooning, artists that could work big, and artists that could use their whole arm to paint with.
Monet, the master of European Impressionism, was now becoming a figurehead for American abstract art.
Monet n'est pas un peintre abstrait, mais il ouvre les portes d'une possibilité de l'abstraction. Et ça, c'est une qualité qui le met au sommet d'une histoire de l'art du XXe siècle.
But although Monet's paintings were resonating with a new generation of artists, the Orangerie itself remained something of an embarrassment. Optimistic visitors couldn't believe the way Monet's grand decorations were being displayed. In 1996, it was finally decreed that the gallery would undergo a $36 million renovation to become a more fitting host to its rediscovered treasure. The responsibility was handed to the architect Olivier Brochet.
Quand nous sommes arrivés la première fois à l'Orangerie, on avait l'impression de descendre à la cave pour aller voir les nymphéas.
Brochet came up with a radical strategy to light Monet's masterpieces in a way the artist had always dreamed of. He decided to remove the concrete ceiling above the water lilies and replace it with a skylight, all without damaging the murals themselves.
C'est un défi technique immense. Les murs que vous voyez, on ne peut pas la déplacer. Et on ne peut pas décrocher ces peintures du mur. Et donc ici, on est en train de construire l'abat-jour pour ramener la lumière. Et les nymphéas, dans les conditions, sont toujours là-dedans, comme celle-là.
Now sitting deep in the heart of a construction site, Monet's canvases had to be protected by specially made cases.
Sur toute l'œuvre, il y avait des palpeurs, tous les 20 cm. Et dès qu'on faisait trop de vibrations au-dessus, il y avait une alerte et le conservateur venait du Louvre et arrêtait le chantier. Très souvent, nous étions obligés d'arrêter le chantier et ça a beaucoup ralenti le chantier.
It took 6 years and almost $40 million, but in 2006, the doors finally reopened. And this time, the public was ready.
You couldn't get more different from the time they were first displayed in 1927. People celebrated, media news went round the world, everyone was queuing to see them.
The paintings were utterly transformed. That space was transformed, and you could finally see the paintings as Monet wanted us to be able to see them, in a kind of natural light, in a beautiful kind of luminescence, which was the sort of light that he strove to paint throughout the course of his entire lifetime.
Notre grande fierté, c'est d'avoir, d'une part, restitué la primauté, la pleine présence de l'œuvre de Monet comme il l'avait voulu, comme il l'avait installé. Elle a retrouvé son esprit d'origine.
Cette incroyable immensité picturale dans laquelle il nous invite finalement à nous plonger et dans laquelle, par le biais de ce bassin, il a capté quelque chose de la beauté du monde. Et c'est là où Monet est un pionnier total.
From being forgotten, they now have a unique importance in the life of this city.
The grand decorations are so special because they were a tribute to the French people. They were a tribute to the war. It wasn't just water and trees. The trees were almost bowing in respect to the Parisians.
It's a temple to art and a temple for modern France.
This whole gallery is devoted to these paintings, and it's what Monet wanted. He wanted it to be a place of meditation, a place of peace, and you see that. You see visitors sitting there peacefully, taking it all on. They're very calming, they're very uplifting. It's an experience, a complete experience.
It's now been nearly 100 years since these epic murals were first hung on the orangery's walls. What an extraordinary journey these canvases have been on, from their traumatic conception to being buried alive and then refound by a new generation. It truly is quite a tale. These aren't really pictures about plants or even reflections. These are pictures of the beauty and transience and therefore the poignancy of human life, indeed all life. None of us are here for very long, but it is gorgeous while it lasts. And that is Monet's message to the French and, thank God, to the rest of us as well. But I don't want to end this as a film about art history. If you possibly can, come and see these pictures for yourself. But please, don't bring a camera. Bring your eyes and your heart, because that is all you need. Next time, the quintessentially English landscape. You want to be there and feel the wind in your face as the clouds scud over your head, which sparked an artistic revolution a long way from home.
French artists cannot believe the originality and the freshness of Constable's approach.
I go behind the canvas of John Constable's Hay Wain.